The first insult landed softly, which made it worse. I was standing 3 feet behind my boss at the head table of the annual donor banquet, holding a stack of briefing folders I had written myself, every page, every footnote, every carefully worded recommendation. Nathaniel Grant had just taken one from my stack and handed it to a senator with the easy confidence of a man who had been claiming other people's work for so long it no longer required effort. He gestured toward me without looking back. "Careful with her near the important people," he said, loud enough for the table. "She still thinks writing the reports means she understands policy." A few donors chuckled. One woman smirked into her wine. My face did not change. I had spent 6 years training it not to change in rooms like this. But my fingers tightened around the remaining folders until the edges pressed into my palm. Because the briefing memo being quoted at the head table was mine. The framework being praised by 3 elected officials was mine. In Nathaniel's version of the world, I was the woman who carried the folders. In the actual world, I had written everything inside them. I was still forcing myself to breathe steadily when the windows started to tremble. Not a vibration you could name at first, more like the building itself developing a low, persistent hum. Then the chandeliers shifted slightly. Someone near the terrace doors said something I couldn't make out over the growing sound. The mechanical thumping was deep and rhythmic, and people were turning toward the glass doors with the collective confusion of a room that had not expected anything to arrive from outside. My boss straightened his posture. He adjusted his jacket lapels with the automatic gesture he used when he sensed power entering a room he had not yet claimed. He was already preparing the wide-open smile he reserved for people who could help him, the smile I had watched him perform many times, each time directed at someone he had decided would be useful. The terrace doors opened. A uniformed officer stepped inside. He scanned the room, methodically, not dramatically, and then his eyes found me and stopped. I had no idea what was about to happen. But I was about to find out that the building's understanding of that evening was wrong, and that the correction was arriving from outside. "Ma'am," he said. The word was clear and unhurried. "DC needs you." The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something has happened that rearranges everyone's understanding of the situation they are in. Nathaniel turned toward me slowly, like a man receiving news his mind has not yet processed. The officer walked past the donors, past the board members, past the senator who had just been handed my briefing folder and told not to worry about the complicated parts. He stopped directly in front of me. "My name is Audrey Whitaker. I had been working at the Meridian Policy Institute." My name for the organization, since the real one was similar, for 6 years. I had produced the research, written the frameworks, built the models, and prepared the presentations that had made the institute nationally recognized in its field. The people in that banquet hall had benefited from that work every day without ever attaching my name to it. And now a federal officer was standing in front of me, in a room full of the people who had laughed at Nathaniel's joke 2 minutes earlier, saying the 4 words that would force them to ask the question they had never bothered to ask before. Who had actually been doing the work? 6 years earlier, I had accepted the position at the institute 2 weeks after finishing graduate school. My thesis had received the highest mark in my program. I had 3 research publications and a recommendation from a federal policy advisor who described my analytical work as among the most sophisticated he had encountered in a decade of graduate research. The job was not what I had imagined, implementation work rather than original research, and lower pay than comparable positions. But I believed, at 26, that good work in a credible organization would eventually produce the recognition it deserved. I believed results spoke. I believed that being reliably excellent would accumulate into something real. A promotion, a lead credit, a moment when the people above me acknowledged that the work they were presenting to the world had come from somewhere, and that somewhere was me. I had been wrong about most of that. But right about one thing. Good work produces real results, and real results eventually require someone to account for them. I just did not know, in those early weeks, how long the accounting would take, or that when it finally arrived, it would arrive on a lawn, from the sky, in the form of a government helicopter. Nathaniel Grant had been the Institute's Director of Policy Operations for 12 years when I joined. He was tall, well-dressed, and possessed of the kind of social ease that I initially interpreted as confidence and later understood as something more deliberate. He had a genuine talent for rooms, for making people feel seen and important, for speaking with the assured cadences of someone who has thought deeply about things, for moving through a cocktail party or a Senate hearing with the fluency of a man who had always expected to be taken seriously. What he did not have, as I discovered within the first month, was the patience or inclination for the kind of sustained analytical work his presentations required. He was a curator, not a builder. He understood which ideas were worth presenting before he fully understood the ideas themselves. And he had developed, over many years, a reliable system for acquiring those ideas from people who would not claim them loudly. People who were good and conscientious, and had been taught that doing excellent work quietly was a form of professional virtue. People like me. I had simply never understood, until it was happening to me, how completely a system like that could erase a person while still relying entirely on what that person produced. The first time Nathaniel presented my work as his own, I was sitting in the back row of a presentation room watching a slide deck I had spent 11 days building appear on the screen under his name. I told myself this was normal. Senior staff often synthesized team research into presentations. That was part of how policy organizations functioned. I had heard other analysts say the same thing, with the tone of people who have been repeating it long enough that it has stopped needing to be examined. He had added his name to the title slide. He had adjusted a few sentences. He presented it to a room of foundation directors and received a standing ovation at the end. I packed up the laptop afterward and drove home and sat in my car for a while before going inside. I told myself it was fine. That credit would come. That what mattered was the quality of the work and the difference it made. I genuinely believed that, in that parking lot, sitting with the engine off. I was 27 years old and I still thought the world was organized around merit in a way that made patience a reasonable strategy. The institutional language around my role had a specific texture I began to notice about a year into the job. In meetings, I was described as reliable. In performance reviews, I was called detail-oriented, thorough, a strong team contributor. When donors asked about the research, Nathaniel would say things like, "My team has done excellent work on this, technically inclusive, practically invisible." My name never appeared in the publications that carried my frameworks. It never appeared in press releases announcing the initiatives I had designed. It appeared in the acknowledgement sections of internal documents that no one outside the organization would read, in small font pages after the conclusion and before the bibliography. Thorough, reliable, detail-oriented, these traveled with my name. Visionary, strategic, bold, these traveled with Nathaniel's. The gap between those two sets of words was not accidental. It was infrastructure, the carefully maintained architecture of who received credit in that building, and who was expected to keep the building standing while that happened. I understood this gap intellectually before I fully understood what it was costing me. I had understood the gap intellectually before I fully understood what it was costing me, and by the time I understood the cost, I had already been absorbing it for years. Most evenings I stayed in the office after the others had gone. Not because I was required to. Nathaniel rarely worked past 6, but because the hours after the building emptied were the hours when I could think clearly. When the phones stopped and the conference rooms went dark, I could sit with the actual work, the policy literature, the data sets, the structural problems in a framework that seemed solid until you pushed on it from a specific angle. There is a particular kind of thinking that requires stillness and time, the kind that involves holding several competing ideas simultaneously while looking for the fault lines between them, and I could sustain it for long stretches without losing the thread. The work I produced in those late evenings, the drafts that became Nathaniel's presentations, the models that became the Institute's flagship programs, the memos that would eventually be quoted by elected officials at donor banquets, came from those hours. Hours nobody saw, nobody thanked, nobody, for a very long time, credited to the person who had spent them. Hours nobody saw, nobody thanked, nobody credited to the person who had spent them, until one Thursday evening when the federal government sent a helicopter to correct the record. 2 years before the banquet, I began developing the policy framework that would eventually land a government helicopter on the banquet lawn. It had started as a small internal project. A request from Nathaniel to produce a summary of existing federal housing policy instruments and their measurable outcomes. Standard research work, the kind of thing I could have finished in 2 weeks. But the more I worked on it, the more I saw that the question the institute had been asking was the wrong question. The instruments were not underperforming because they were poorly designed. They were underperforming because they were operating in isolation from each other, and no one had built a model for how they could be sequenced and coordinated to produce compounding rather than competing effects. I spent 7 months building that model. I ran it against 15 years of federal data. I tested it against 3 different regional housing markets and documented the projected outcomes at each stage. When I brought it to Nathaniel, I expected him to ask questions, push back on the methodology, challenge my assumptions. Instead, he read the executive summary, looked up at me, and said, "This is exactly what we need for the fall donor season." The day Nathaniel presented the framework to an audience of foundation directors, congressional staffers, and 2 senior officials from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, I sat in the back row of the auditorium with my laptop open and a notepad on my knee. He used my slides. He used my language. He used the specific metaphor I had developed to explain the compounding sequencing model. An image I had spent an afternoon refining because I needed something that would make a highly technical mechanism legible to a non-specialist audience. He delivered it with the ease of someone who had thought of it himself, which I suppose, by that point, was how he experienced it. After the presentation, the HUD officials stayed to ask questions. Detailed questions, technical questions, the kind that required the person who had built the model to answer them. Nathaniel handled the first 2 with the smooth confidence of someone who has memorized a summary. On the 3rd question, his answer began to drift. I watched him from the back row. I did not stand up. I did not raise my hand. I sat with my notepad and watched him navigate the limits of what a summary could support, and I thought, someday this will matter. I just did not know how soon. After the HUD presentation, the pattern did what patterns do when they are left unaddressed: it consolidated. The framework became the Institute's primary program. Federal partners began referencing it in their own materials. The Institute received 2 major grants on the strength of it. Nathaniel was profiled in a policy journal as the architect of an innovative new approach to housing coordination. I read the profile in my office on a Tuesday morning. My name appeared once, in a sentence that described me as a member of the research team that supported the initiative. I put the journal down and went back to the data analysis I had been working on, which was the second phase of the same framework, which would eventually be cited in the same profile's footnotes under additional institutional research. The thing about being systematically uncredited is that it does not arrive as one large assault that you can point to and name. It arrives as an accumulation, a word here, an omission there, a profile that got your contribution exactly wrong, and the accumulation is designed, whether consciously or not, to make you feel like you are overreacting each time you notice a single instance of it. Nathaniel told me about the Banquet invitation in the way he delivered all information he considered minor. He stopped at my office door one afternoon while I was mid-sentence and said the Institute was hosting its annual donor dinner and he wanted me to attend. He said it would be good exposure. He said the donors would benefit from seeing the research team. He did not say, "I want you there to carry folders and absorb whatever ambient humiliation comes from being visibly useful in a room that has decided you are not important." That part was subtext. I should have been better at reading it. I had read his subtext correctly on enough occasions that this one should not have surprised me. But I went. I wore my best professional clothes. I arrived early, helped organize the briefing materials, and stood near the head table holding a stack of folders containing my own work, waiting to be useful in whatever capacity was required. Within 40 minutes I had been made into a punchline. Within an hour everything changed. Within 40 minutes I had been made into a punchline. Within an hour everything changed in a way none of us in that room, including me, had any way to have anticipated. The officer's voice was steady and professional. He did not seem to register the social electricity of the room, the way the guests had shifted in their seats, the way Nathaniel's expression was moving through several stages simultaneously, the way the woman who had smirked into her wine was now watching me with a different kind of attention. The federal task force implementing the housing coordination framework needs your immediate input, the officer said. There's a critical implementation question they were unable to resolve from the documentation. He paused. You are listed as the lead architect. The briefing we received identifies you as the person who designed the model. Nathaniel made a sound. It was not quite a word. Something between a laugh and a correction. The noise a person makes when they are about to reframe a situation and have not yet decided how. She works on my team, he said. His voice was smooth, but the smoothness cost something. I could hear it costing. The officer looked at him briefly. Yes, sir, he said, with the polite neutrality of someone who has been trained to be courteous to everyone while taking direction from none of them. Then he looked back at me. Ma'am, the helicopter is waiting. The question came from a foundation director near the center table, a woman named Cornelia who had known Nathaniel for a decade and had always treated me as part of the room's furniture. Why her specifically? She asked, not rudely, with the genuine curiosity of a person who needs the world to make sense. The officer answered without inflection. The framework documentation cites Ms. Whitaker as the sole primary author, he said. The implementation team has questions that require the person who designed the model to answer. The room absorbed this. I watched it land, the sequential way it moved, face by face. The senator who had accepted my briefing folder. The board members who had applauded Nathaniel's presentation 2 years ago. Cornelia, whose expression was rearranging into something I could not easily read. And Nathaniel, standing with one hand on the back of a chair, looking at me with the expression of a man who has just understood, in public, that something he believed he owned does not actually belong to him. And Nathaniel, standing with one hand on the back of a chair, looking at me with the expression of a man who has just understood, in public, that something he believed he owned does not actually belong to him. And never had. Nathaniel recovered. He always recovered. It was one of his genuine skills, the ability to absorb an unexpected development and produce a response that sounded authoritative within seconds. Of course, he said. Audrey has been central to this work. We're very proud of what the team has produced. Though we landed precisely wrong in that context. I looked at him. I had been looking at him for 6 years across various versions of this moment, the moment where he incorporated my contributions into his ownership with a single pronoun, and I had, each time, swallowed the response that rose in me. Not this time. Not in this room. Not in front of this audience, with a uniformed officer standing beside me who had just told 70 people that the federal government needed me specifically. I'll need my laptop, I said. My voice was calm. Completely calm. The officer nodded. I retrieved my bag from under the table where I had stored it before the banquet began. I straightened. I looked at the room, not at Nathaniel specifically, just at the room, the whole collected room that had laughed at me 40 minutes ago. Excuse me, I said. And I walked out. The inside of the helicopter was louder than I expected. 2 other federal staff were already seated, reviewing documents on tablets. The officer briefed me quickly. A federal pilot program had begun implementing the framework in 3 cities, and in the second week of operations a critical sequencing conflict had emerged that threatened to collapse the compounding effect the entire model depended on. The team had worked through the documentation for 2 days without resolution. Someone had flagged my name from the original research files. Someone had then located where I was. Someone had decided the fastest way to get the answer was to come and get the person who had it. I looked out the window at the banquet hall receding below, the lights still on, the tent still standing. Somewhere inside, Nathaniel was explaining to donors that of course he had always recognized my contributions. I thought about the 7 months I had spent building the model. The back row of the auditorium. The parking lot after the first stolen presentation. Then I turned back to my laptop and started working. Which was what I had always done, and what I was, it turned out, still going to be doing long after this particular evening was over. The federal briefing room was quiet and fluorescent lit, the kind of space where the decor communicates nothing except that serious work happens here. 7 senior officials sat on one side of the table. I sat on the other, alone, with my laptop open and the original framework documentation on screen. They had questions, not summary-level questions like the ones Nathaniel had fielded at the HUD presentation, but detailed, structural questions about the model's assumptions and its limits, about why I had designed the sequencing in a particular order and what happened to the compounding effect if that order was disrupted. I answered every one. I answered directly, with the specificity of someone who had spent 7 months building the thing being asked about. And I felt something shift as I answered. some recalibration of what my voice was capable of when a room had already decided it knew what it was talking about. I had written the work supporting tables like this one for 6 years. I had simply never been asked to sit at one. I had written the work supporting tables like this one for 6 years. I had simply never been asked to sit at one. It turned out that sitting at one felt exactly like I had imagined it would. 2 days after the federal briefing, Nathaniel arrived in Washington. He had taken the early train and appeared at the building where the implementation meetings were being held with the confident stride of a man who believes his presence will be welcomed. He introduced himself to the department officials with his standard presentation mode energy, warm, authoritative, establishing ownership through casual deployment of the program's name. The officials were polite. They thanked him for coming. And then they turned their attention back to me, because the questions they had were not questions Nathaniel could answer. I watched him understand this in the specific, gradual way that difficult understanding tends to arrive. First the minor confusion of being redirected. Then the sharper confusion of being asked a question he could not answer while I answered it from across the table. Then the very particular expression of a man who has spent his career as the most important person in every room, encountering for the first time a room in which that simply is not true. Then the very particular expression of a man who has spent his career as the most important person in every room, encountering for the first time a room in which that is simply not true, and having no prepared response for it. When I returned to the institute the following week, something had changed in the building's texture. People who had not made eye contact with me in 2 years were suddenly available for conversation. An analyst 2 offices down stopped by to tell me she had always thought the framework work was remarkable. I received congratulatory emails from 3 board members who had never communicated with me directly before. Meanwhile, I learned through a colleague that Nathaniel had been telling people the federal attention was a misunderstanding, that the documentation had been incorrectly attributed, that I had been a valued contributor but not the primary author, that the distinction between team research and individual authorship was more complex than the briefing had suggested. I kept a record of this. I had been keeping records for years, not as a premeditated strategy, exactly, but because I was the kind of person who documented things carefully, the same way I was the kind of person who stayed late and wrote the careful footnotes. That habit, invisible for 6 years, was about to become the most important thing about me. That habit, invisible for 6 years, was about to become the most important thing about me in a process that had already begun without my knowing it was underway. The Institute's board of directors initiated a formal authorship review 3 weeks after the banquet. I did not know who had requested it, whether it had come from the federal partners, from a board member who had been in the room that evening, or from the simple gravitational pull of a discrepancy that had become too public to ignore. What I knew was that the review existed, and that it would proceed by examining the thing Nathaniel had spent years hoping no one would examine closely, the documentary record. Draft histories, version control logs, email threads, meeting notes with timestamps, project files with authorship metadata. The kind of evidence that does not adjust its account based on who is telling the story. I cooperated fully. I provided every document I had. I had kept thorough records not as a deliberate strategy, or not entirely, but because I was the kind of person who kept thorough records, the same way I was the kind of person who stayed late and fixed the data and wrote the careful footnotes that nobody read. That habit, which had been invisible for 6 years, was about to become the most important thing about me. The review took 5 weeks. I watched Nathaniel's behavior during those weeks the way you watch weather, not with investment in a particular outcome, just with attention. He remained outwardly composed through most of the first 2 weeks. His meetings, his presentations, his board navigation all ran with the polished reasonableness he had always deployed when things needed to be managed. In the 3rd week, something in his composure became effortful in a way that had not been visible before. He arrived late to meetings where he had always been early. He answered board questions with slightly more words than necessary, a sign, I had learned over 6 years of watching him, that he was working harder than usual to sound confident. In the 4th week, a board member who had always been closely aligned with him stopped sitting next to him at the weekly leadership meeting and moved to the other side of the table without explanation. That shift, 3 seats across a conference table, was the most accurate indicator I had seen of where things were heading. That shift, 3 seats across a conference table, without explanation or announcement, was the most accurate indicator I had seen of where things were heading. Nathaniel's final effort came in the form of a meeting he requested with the board's governance committee in the 4th week of the review. I was not present, but I received a full account from the committee chair. He had argued that the authorship question was being misunderstood, that in a research organization, policy frameworks are inherently collaborative, that individual attribution is always an oversimplification, and that his role as director had involved substantive intellectual contribution at every stage. He had argued this competently and with the language of someone who had spent 12 years developing exactly this kind of argument. The committee chair told me he had been articulate and composed. She also told me the committee had then spent 40 minutes reviewing version-controlled draft documents that showed, in the precise time-stamped record of a document management system, that the framework had been built in my hands, in my hours, in the late evenings when the building was empty. Articulate and composed, she said, but unable to account for the timeline. And in the end, the timeline was all that mattered. Articulate and composed, she said, but unable to account for the timeline. And in the end, the timeline was all that mattered. The board meeting at which Nathaniel was removed from his leadership position was held on a Wednesday morning. I was not in the room. I had been asked whether I wanted to be present and I had said no, because I had spent 6 years in rooms watching Nathaniel perform, and I did not need to watch the performance end in order to know that it had. The chair called me afterward. She told me the decision had been made by consensus, that the board had concluded the institute's leadership structure needed to reflect its actual intellectual architecture, and that they would be in touch about next steps. She used measured, institutional language, the kind that conveys everything important without naming it directly. I sat with the phone after the call ended and thought about the banquet. The laughter. The way Nathaniel had gestured toward me like I was part of the serving staff. The smirk into the wine glass. The senator accepting my folder and being told not to worry about the complicated parts. I did not feel triumph, exactly. I felt the specific relief of someone who has been carrying a weight that was not theirs to carry, and has finally been allowed to set it down. The institute offered me the senior leadership position 2 weeks after Nathaniel's removal. The federal department requested my continued involvement in the framework's national rollout. My name appeared on the documentation, on press releases, on congressional briefing materials. I received a call from the Policy Journal that had profiled Nathaniel as the framework's architect. They wanted to run a correction and a profile of the actual work. I told them I would think about it. I was not interested in the reversal as a performance. I was interested in the work, which was still the same work it had always been, and which still needed doing in the same methodical way. What had changed was not the work itself but the infrastructure around it, the chain of credit, the documentation of authorship, the institutional acknowledgement that the source of the institute's reputation was the same person who had been carrying its folders at a banquet while being mocked for thinking she understood anything important. I no longer had to do the work invisibly. I could just do the work. I no longer had to do the work invisibly. I could simply do the work, with my name on it, in a room that had finally decided to acknowledge where the work was actually coming from. There is a particular moment I return to, months after the banquet, that feels like the real ending. I am sitting at the desk that used to be Nathaniel's, in an office looking out over the same lawn where the helicopter landed. It is a late evening and the building is quiet, the phone's off, the conference room's dark, the specific stillness that means I can think. I am working on the 3rd phase of the framework. The same work. The same kind of attention it has always required. Nothing about the work itself has changed because of anything that happened at a banquet or in a Washington briefing room. But something has changed about the room I am doing it in. The door has my name on it. The documents have my name on them. The federal partners address their questions to me. And sometimes I think about the woman who stood 3 feet behind a man at a head table, fingers tight around folders full of her own ideas. She was never background. She was always the whole story. It just took the right moment, a helicopter, a federal officer, and a room full of people who had been laughing, for everyone to finally read it.